This is really difficult. People are looking at the data, criticising the data, but effectively trying to get as much information we can about Omicron to work out what restrictions should be imposed. Do you think there's enough of an evidence base to say we need a toughening up of the rules that we've currently got in place?
Well, I think the first thing to really look at is the data that's coming out from some of the other countries across the world. And I've been looking at this kind of Denmark, who's got the second highest cases in Europe. And the rate of hospitalizations with the new Omicron variant is relatively low compared to previous waves. And we've seen something similar in South Africa. That the issue really is that if you obviously, because it's more transmissible, if you get double the number of cases but only half the number of people who need to go into hospital, you end up with the same amount of people going in, basically. So when you do the arithmetic, I think the big issue we've got are kind of just these scientific models, which I think the Richie Sunak is questioning. We've had Neil Ferguson coming out in recent days saying there could be up to 5,000 deaths a day. I've written a blog myself looking at the figures here, and to get anywhere near 5,000 deaths a day, you would need 1.7 million cases per day by the end of January when you start doing the maths to kind of get to the 5,000 deaths a day. And to get to 1.7 million deaths by the end of January, you've got to continue to see deaths going up and up and up each kind of day, they're exponentially. So that would mean 25 million cases by the end of January to kind of hit Neil Ferguson's kind of projection. And remember, these are cases that are identified. We know that some people who are infected don't get tested, so we don't identify them as a case. It's about twice as many. So what that would mean is to get these predictions that some of the SAGE scientists are coming up with, Neil Ferguson, you'd need 56 million infections between now and the end of January. And we've administered 126 million vaccinations. So I just don't think some of the modelling stacks up, because we're in a much different place to last year. And I think it's right that the ministers are challenging some of these assumptions.
When did the modelling stack up? I mean, we've had dire predictions from day one on this, some of them from Neil Ferguson. They never happened. And aren't the public perhaps showing that frustration by doing their own thing? They are taking responsibility on themselves, restaurants and pubs complaining that not people are cancelling. Well, they're cancelling out of their own free will because they're taking responsibility. We don't need further restrictions, do we?
Well, I think you're right there in terms of the public. And where you said, when do the models stack up? Last week, Sajid Javid was claiming there was 200,000 Omicron cases. And if you look at the model of where that number come from, it would have meant that the whole of England would have been infected with Omicron by Christmas Day. And they've rolled back on that now, saying that those numbers are no longer valid, partly because they were just absolute nonsense. But these have been driven all over the media, ministers going out and talking about them. So, Mark Drakeford in Wales has announced he's closing nightclubs. He was pressed yesterday in terms of what support is he going to have for nightclubs, and he said that, I can't promise anything. I think, you're right. People are taking kind of their own way around this. We've got significant proportions now, Simon, of the population who are most vulnerable already boosted. And if you look at the data coming out of Denmark, even those who've had a booster jab are still catching Omicron. So it's not, we know these vaccines aren't going to stop people catching kind of even this new variant. So the important thing is the most vulnerable people, who would be the ones who end up in hospital, have had this booster jab, the majority of them. And if that's the way out, vaccination's the way out rather than lockdowns, because, all lockdown would do is just press pause on the kind of what's going to happen, and then reopen in January and it's all happen again. So, we've got to look at the data carefully before we go to the knee-jerk reaction here.
When might we know, lockdown by stealth, whatever you want to call it, people making decisions not to go out and not to go to the theatre or go to the pub, when might we know if that sort of public shift in behaviour is having an actual impact on the number of cases and hospitalisations?
Well, it's going to be difficult for the next couple of weeks. So let's just explain why. So in Wales and Scotland, we've seen hospitalisations coming down for a while now. They're at kind of a 3-month low in Wales. The worry there is that Omicron will mean they go up. England's been falling as well. Slight tick up because of London in recent weeks. But an important thing to point out with the London numbers, as we see Omicron spreading and becoming kind of a bit less deadly, is we are seeing in London now that patients going into hospital with COVID, with Omicron, we get some stats to say, are they in because of COVID or just with COVID? And we're starting to see more people going into hospital with COVID, but not because of it in London. I think what we'll be looking for really is trying to track the numbers. But remember now, the schools are coming to a close now for the Christmas period. And every time they close, because they are a large vector of the transmission, we tend to see that cases generally start coming down. So we may start seeing the pause, like a mini fire break or mini restrictions, just by closing the schools. I think we will clearly hear from the sector if people are not turning up to the kind of venues, hospitality. That will obviously come through in the next couple of weeks as well. But, I wouldn't rush to push the panic button. We've got to look at the facts and the figures. And at the moment, I wouldn't be pushing it too hard.
Yeah, and the public mood is one of, we're all fed up with being in this position. Of course we are. The large number of large demonstrations over the weekend show that people are reaching a point where, well, the government's got to take notice when large numbers of people come out on the street and say that enough have been told what to do, have been having their lives restricted. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, this is something the government has to take into account, isn't it?
No, indeed. There's obviously a hardcore people who don't believe in vaccination, but there's a hardcore number of people who had the vaccinations as well. They were told, 15 million jabs to freedom. Well, we're 126 million now, and we're still having some of the threats of more restrictions. I think my concern as well is that, you talk about these vaccine passes, which clearly don't do anything because the First Minister in Wales is closing nightclubs when you can only get in with one of them anyway. It's that there's millions of people who've been double jabbed, who've had COVID, similar to myself. And it's quite clear the way the government's working that if you don't have a booster in the next few weeks, you won't be able to be eligible for a COVID pass. I think there'll be even more demonstrations when that occurs. I think just, following the data, following the science is important. And last thing, Simon, is last week, the government removed kind of natural immunity from the COVID pass. And yesterday, Sajid Javid was claiming that South Africa might be doing pretty well because of previous infections and natural immunity. So there's no scientific basis for saying if you've had COVID and you've got the protection from that, you can't have a COVID pass unless you have a vaccine. It's just
well hang on. I've got to pick you up on that, Jamie, because there was a report from Imperial just 3 days ago, and we've been talking about it this morning, which says the difficulty with the Omicron variant is that previous infection is no protection. That this variant is like getting it afresh, whether you've had it before or not, and that's a problem.
Well, I think we still got to look at the kind of the facts and the figures coming out from there, because if you look at the infection rate for Omicron in Denmark, we're seeing that the unvaccinated group, which will include people who've had previous infection, the proportion who are unvaccinated catching Omicron is lower than the proportion in the population who are unvaccinated. So I think we have to some caution with regards to kind of the previous infections, because ultimately this vaccine was designed for the previous variants. If the body isn't providing protection for Omicron, why would the vaccine be doing that?
Okay, Jamie, thank you very much for joining us. Jamie Jenkins, good to talk to you.